esteem. Let's start with this idea of the goldfish, because it sounds almost playful, but it's actually one of the most painful survival strategies I see in toxic relationships. Esteem. A goldfish is said to have a very short memory. It forgets what just happened, swims forward, and keeps going. And in a toxic relationship, esteem. Many of you become emotional goldfish not because you're not a V or weak, but because forgetting is the only way you know how to stay afloat. Think about it. Esteem. If you remembered every dismissive comment, every broken promise, every time you were invalidated, ignored, humiliated, or made to feel small, the weight of that reality would be unbearable. Esteem. So your mind does something very clever. It minimizes, it rationalizes, it smooths over the sharp edges of what happened. You tell yourself, esteem, it wasn't that bad, or they were stressed, or they didn't mean it that way, and just like that, the slate is wiped clean enough for you to keep going. Not because things are okay, esteem, but because stopping to fully remember would force you to confront something terrifying, that the relationship itself might not be safe. In toxic dynamics, esteem, forgetting becomes a form of self-protection. It's emotional anesthesia. You numb yourself to the pain so you can function, so you can get through the day, esteem, so you can preserve some version of hope. Many of you were taught early on that remembering pain is dangerous. Maybe growing up, you had to overlook harm to maintain peace, esteem. Maybe you learned that speaking up only made things worse. So you adapted, you learned to forget quickly, to move on fast, to reset yourself after every emotional injury. Esteem. That doesn't make you broken. It makes you adaptive. But here's the problem. When forgetting becomes a pattern, it doesn't just erase the pain, it erases the data. And data matters. Esteem. Those moments you're brushing past, those little things you tell yourself not to dwell on, they're not isolated incidents, they're patterns. Esteem. And patterns are how we understand who someone really is, not who they promise to be in their good moments. Many people in toxic relationships confuse forgiveness with amnesia, esteem. They believe that being loving, patient, or emotionally evolved means letting things go as quickly as possible. So they rush themselves to move on before there's been accountability, repair, esteem, or real change. They don't allow themselves the discomfort of sitting with what happened. And in doing so, they unknowingly train themselves to tolerate more and more harm, esteem. You might notice this shows up as emotional whiplash. One moment you're deeply hurt, the next you're telling yourself it's fine. One moment you're questioning everything, esteem. The next you're back to hoping things will be different. That's the goldfish cycle. Hurt, forget, repeat. Hurt, forget, repeat. And over time, esteem. This constant resetting doesn't make you more resilient. It makes you more disconnected from your own inner compass. What's especially painful is that many of you blame yourselves for this. Esteem, you'll say, why do I keep ending up here? Or, why don't I learn my lesson? But the truth is, you did learn a lesson. You learned how to survive, esteem. You learned how to keep loving in an environment that didn't always love you back. The issue isn't that you forget. The issue is that you had to. And here's the shift I want you to sit with, esteem. Forgetting harm is not the same as healing from it. Healing requires remembering with clarity, not emotionless replay, but honest acknowledgement, esteem. It requires allowing your experiences to count. Because when you stop forgetting, you don't become bitter or stuck in the past, you become informed, esteem. You don't need a better memory to change your life. You need permission to remember what mattered, esteem. Now let's talk about why this short memory works so well for the other person in the relationship. Because this isn't happening in a vacuum. When you forget, someone else benefits, esteem. And in toxic dynamics, that benefit is not accidental. It's structural. Toxic people thrive in environments where there is no historical record. When yesterday disappears, esteem, today can be rewritten. If there's no continuity, there's no accountability. Each interaction stands alone, detached from the last one, and that gives the other person enormous power, esteem. They can hurt you, dismiss you, cross a line, and then show up the next day as if nothing happened. And if you bring it up, esteem, you're suddenly dwelling, being dramatic, or able to move on, your forgetting becomes their freedom. Think about how often you've heard some version of this, esteem. Why are you bringing that up now? Or that was a long time ago. Or you're still stuck on that. These statements aren't about resolution, they're about erasure, esteem. They're designed to shut down memory so the pattern can continue uninterrupted. Because if the past were allowed to exist in the room, a lot of uncomfortable truths would have to be faced, esteem. When someone benefits from your forgetting, they never have to repair. Repair requires acknowledgement. Repair requires empathy. Repair requires change. But if the slate is always clean, esteem, there's nothing to fix. The relationship becomes a loop of rupture without repair, harm without accountability, pain without meaning. And over time, esteem, you're conditioned to believe that this is just how relationships work. There's also something subtler happening. When you forget, you carry the emotional burden alone, esteem. The other person doesn't have to hold the weight of what they did. You do, you absorb it, metabolize it, minimize it, and then you re-enter the relationship as if you're starting fresh, esteem. That imbalance is not sustainable and it's not accidental. It keeps the power dynamic exactly where it is. In narcissistic and toxic patterns, charm often follows harm. After a blow-up, esteem, there may be affection, humor, gifts, or vulnerability. Not because there's insight, but because warmth is an effective reset button. It makes you question your own memory. You think, esteem, maybe I overreacted, or they're being so nice now, maybe it wasn't that serious. This is how forgetting is reinforced, esteem. The relief you feel in the good moments trains you to tolerate the bad ones. What's important to understand is that many toxic people don't need you to fully forget, esteem. They just need you to doubt yourself enough to drop the issue. Confusion works almost as well as amnesia. If you're unsure, hesitant, or second-guessing your experience, the conversation ends, esteem. And once it ends, the pattern survives. This is where people often get stuck in self-blame. You'll say, esteem, I should have said something sooner, or I should have stood my ground. But you were up against a system that rewarded silence and punished memory. Each time you tried to hold on to the past, esteem, you were met with dismissal, defensiveness, or emotional withdrawal. So eventually, you learned to let go before the cost became too high. Here's the hard truth, esteem. Someone who truly cares about you will want to understand your experience, even when it's uncomfortable. They won't need you to forget in order to stay connected, esteem. They won't frame your memory as an attack. When forgetting becomes a requirement for peace, that peace is conditional, and it always comes at your expense, esteem. So if you're wondering why this dynamic feels so one-sided, why you're always the one resetting, forgiving, and moving on, it's because the relationship is built on your amnesia, esteem. And the moment you stop forgetting, the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. If someone needs you to forget who they are in order to stay with them, remembering is no longer optional, esteem. It's necessary. Once forgetting becomes expected, something even more destabilizing often enters the picture, the slow erosion of your trust in your own memory, esteem. This is where gaslighting does its real damage, not in the dramatic moments where someone flat out denies reality, but in the quiet, esteem, repetitive ways your experience is questioned until you start questioning it yourself. Gaslighting is not just being told, that didn't happen. More often, it sounds like, esteem, you're too sensitive? That's not what I meant? You always twist things? Or, you're remembering it wrong. Each comment on its own might seem minor. But over time, they stack up, esteem. And the cumulative effect is profound. You begin to hesitate before speaking. You replay conversations in your head, trying to figure out where you went wrong, esteem. You start asking for confirmation about things you once felt sure of. That hesitation is the moment your internal compass begins to wobble. In a healthy relationship, esteem, your perception is treated as valid even when there's disagreement. In a toxic one, your perception becomes the problem. The goal isn't necessarily to convince you of an alternate reality, esteem. It's to destabilize your confidence in your own. Because when you're unsure, you're easier to manage. Uncertainty keeps you stuck. If you can't trust your memory, esteem, you can't trust your decisions. And if you can't trust your decisions, leaving or setting boundaries feels terrifying, esteem. Many people experiencing gaslighting describe a strange kind of mental fog. They'll say things like, esteem, I feel confused all the time, or I don't know what's real anymore. That confusion is not accidental. It's the byproduct of repeatedly having your emotional and cognitive reality dismissed, esteem. When every concern is reframed as an overreaction, you eventually stop bringing concerns at all. You silence yourself not because you agree, esteem, but because it's exhausting to defend your own reality. What makes this especially painful is that gaslighting often comes from someone you care about deeply, esteem, someone whose approval matters to you. So you give their version of events more weight than your own. You think, esteem, they wouldn't lie, or maybe they know me better than I know myself. And slowly you outsource your sense of reality. You start checking in with them before you check in with yourself, esteem. This is where memory erosion becomes a form of self-betrayal, even though it never starts that way. You don't wake up one day and decide to distrust yourself, esteem. You arrive there after countless small moments of being corrected, minimized, or told your feelings don't make sense. Over time, you stop trusting what your body remembers, esteem. How your chest tightened, how your stomach dropped, how something felt off long before you could explain why. Those signals get overwritten by someone else's narrative, esteem. And here's the part that's often misunderstood. Gaslighting doesn't always require malicious intent, but the impact is the same regardless, esteem. Whether the person is doing it deliberately or defensively, the result is that you lose access to your own lived experience. You become dependent on someone else to define what's true, esteem, what's acceptable, and what you're allowed to feel. This creates a dangerous loop. The more you doubt yourself, the more you defer. The more you defer, esteem, the more power the other person has to shape the story. And the longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to imagine trusting yourself again. You might even fear that if you leave esteem, you won't know how to function on your own. That fear isn't a reflection of your weakness, it's evidence of how thoroughly your confidence has been undermined. But here's what matters, esteem. Your memory doesn't have to be perfect to be valid. You don't need a transcript to justify your feelings. If something hurt, it hurt. If something felt wrong, it was wrong for you, esteem. Healing begins when you stop arguing with your own experience and start honoring it again. The moment you choose to trust your memory over their narrative, the fog begins to lift, esteem. By the time someone has spent months or years forgetting, minimizing, and doubting themselves, there is a cost, and it's not always obvious at first, esteem. The cost of being a goldfish isn't just about what happened in the relationship, it's about what slowly happens to you. Piece by piece, something essential begins to erode esteem. And many people don't realize it until they feel empty, anxious, or disconnected and can't quite explain why. One of the first costs is emotional exhaustion, esteem. Constantly resetting yourself takes energy. Every time you swallow your feelings, reframe the hurt, and convince yourself it's fine, you're doing emotional labor, esteem. You're working overtime to keep the relationship stable, and no one is clocking those hours but you. Over time, that effort turns into fatigue. You may feel tired even after rest, esteem, overwhelmed by small decisions, or strangely numb in moments where you think you should feel something. That's not burnout from life, it's burnout from emotional self-erasure, esteem. Another cost is anxiety. When harm keeps happening but is never acknowledged, your nervous system stays on high alert. You might not consciously remember every incident, but your body does, esteem. It learns that connection is unpredictable, that safety can vanish without warning, so you become hypervigilant. You scan tone, facial expressions, and moods, esteem. You rehearse conversations before they happen. You brace yourself without knowing what you're bracing for. That ongoing tension becomes a background hum in your life, esteem. There's also a quiet loss of identity that happens when you're always forgetting yourself for the sake of the relationship. You stop asking what you want because it feels irrelevant, esteem. You stop trusting your preferences, your reactions, your needs. Over time, people will say things like, esteem, I don't know who I am anymore, or I feel like I disappeared. That's not dramatic language. It's an accurate description of what happens when your inner world is repeatedly deprioritized, esteem. Many people in this place feel shame for not leaving sooner. They'll say, I should have known better, or I let this happen. But shame misses the point. You weren't weak, you were adapting, esteem. You were trying to preserve connection in the only way that seemed possible. The problem is that adaptation without safety eventually turns against you, esteem. What once helped you survive starts to harm you. Another significant cost is the way this pattern leaks into other areas of your life. You may find yourself minimizing at work, esteem, over-apologizing with friends, or second-guessing decisions that have nothing to do with the relationship. When you train yourself not to trust your memory or emotions, esteem, that habit doesn't stay contained. It reshapes how you show up everywhere. You become smaller, quieter, more accommodating, not because that's who you are, esteem, but because that's who you had to be. There's also grief here. Grief for the version of yourself who spoke freely, who trusted their instincts, esteem, who didn't feel the need to constantly explain or justify their feelings. Many people don't realize they're grieving because nothing tangible was lost. But something was, esteem, your sense of internal safety, your confidence in your own reality, your right to take up emotional space, esteem. And perhaps the most painful cost is that forgetting keeps you stuck in hope rather than truth. As long as you're not fully remembering the pattern, esteem, there's always the possibility that things will change. That hope can be comforting, but it's also immobilizing. It delays hard decisions, esteem. It keeps you waiting for a version of the relationship that hasn't shown up consistently. This is why being a goldfish isn't neutral. It's not just a personality quirk or a coping style, esteem. It's a slow, cumulative injury, and the longer it goes on, the harder it becomes to recognize yourself in the mirror. When you stop forgetting, you don't lose love, you stop losing yourself, esteem. At some point in this process, a subtle but powerful shift has to happen. You begin to realize that remembering is not the same as being angry, resentful, or stuck in the past, esteem. Remembering is an act of self-respect. It's the moment you decide that your experiences matter enough to be held with clarity instead of erased for convenience. Esteem. Many people have been taught that holding on to memory makes them difficult, unforgiving, or negative, so they rush themselves to let it go before they've even understood what happened. Esteem. But letting go without understanding isn't healing, it's avoidance. True emotional maturity isn't about how quickly you move on. Esteem. It's about how honestly you're willing to look at what's been done to you. When you start to remember in a healthy way, you're not replaying every painful moment on a loop. Esteem. You're stepping back and observing patterns. You're asking, does this keep happening? Instead of, how do I explain this away? You're using memory as information, not as a weapon. Esteem. And that distinction is critical. Memory becomes data. It helps you make informed decisions rather than emotionally reactive ones. This is where many people feel fear. Esteem. They worry that if they really allow themselves to remember, they'll become bitter or hardened. But what actually happens is the opposite. Clarity reduces chaos. Esteem. When you understand the pattern, you stop arguing with yourself. You stop needing endless reassurance. You stop living in that exhausting loop of hope and disappointment. Esteem. Remembering gives your nervous system something solid to stand on. Honoring your memory also means honoring your body. Your body has been keeping score this whole time. Esteem. It remembers the tension, the dread, the moments of relief followed by disappointment. When you allow yourself to acknowledge those signals instead of overriding them, esteem, you begin to rebuild trust with yourself. That trust is foundational. Without it, no boundary will hold. Self-respect doesn't mean becoming rigid or closed off. Esteem, it means slowing down your forgiveness. It means requiring repair before reconciliation. It means recognizing that love without accountability is not intimacy, it's endurance. Esteem. When you respect yourself, you no longer measure the health of a relationship by how much you can tolerate, but by how safe you feel being fully present in it. For many people, esteem. This is the first time they allow themselves to say, "This hurt," without immediately following it with, "But it's okay." That pause is powerful. It creates space for truth. And in that space, esteem. Something important happens. You start choosing yourself not out of anger, but out of alignment. This shift also challenges the story you may have been telling yourself about strength. Esteem. Strength is not how much you can forget. Strength is how well you can hold reality and still act with integrity. Remembering doesn't make you cruel or unforgiving. It makes you discerning. Esteem. And discernment is a form of care. As you reclaim your memory, you may notice discomfort. That's normal. You're stepping out of a pattern that once kept you safe. Esteem. But safety built on self-erasure is not safety, it's containment. Real safety allows your full experience to exist without penalty. When you remember with clarity, esteem, you stop negotiating with your own reality. And that is the moment self-respect becomes non-negotiable. Once you begin to remember, really remember, esteem, the final step is learning how to live differently with that awareness. This is where the cycle breaks, not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of small, steady shifts that move you from emotional amnesia into conscious choice. Breaking the goldfish cycle doesn't start with confrontation or ultimatums. It starts with slowing down. Esteem. Instead of rushing to forgive, rushing to explain, rushing to smooth things over, you pause. You let yourself feel the discomfort of what just happened without immediately trying to fix it. Esteem. That pause is powerful because it interrupts the old reflex to erase your own experience. You give yourself time to ask, what does this mean? Rather than, how do I make this go away? Esteem. One of the most effective tools here is documentation, not in a punitive way, but in a grounding one. Writing things down helps counter the fog. It creates continuity. Esteem. When you can see patterns on paper, it becomes harder to minimize them. This isn't about building a case against someone else. It's about building trust with yourself. You're saying, esteem, my experiences deserve to be remembered. As awareness grows, boundaries naturally begin to form. Boundaries are not punishments, they're information. Esteem. They clarify what you will and will not accept moving forward. And here's the key difference from the past: boundaries don't require the other person's understanding or agreement to be valid. Esteem. They are decisions you make to protect your well-being, not negotiations you have to win. You may notice resistance when you stop forgetting. That's normal. Esteem. When a dynamic has relied on your flexibility, your clarity can feel threatening. You might be told you've changed, that you're colder, or that you're overthinking. In reality, esteem, you've stopped accommodating harm. That's not cruelty, it's growth. Another important shift is learning to tolerate the discomfort of being misunderstood. For a long time, esteem, you may have equated being understood with being safe, so you over-explained, you justified, you tried to bring the other person along with you. Esteem. Breaking the cycle means accepting that clarity doesn't always lead to validation. And that's okay. You don't need consensus to honor your truth. This phase often comes with grief, esteem, grief for the relationship you hoped for, grief for the time you spent waiting, grief for the version of yourself who worked so hard to make things okay. Let that grief exist. Esteem. It's not a sign of failure, it's a sign of honesty. You're no longer numbing yourself to stay attached. As you move forward, esteem, the question shifts from how do I make this relationship work to what kind of relationships work for me. That's a profound reorientation. It puts your values, safety, esteem, and emotional health at the center of your life. From that place, decisions become clearer. You stop chasing potential and start responding to patterns. Esteem. Breaking the cycle doesn't always mean leaving immediately. Sometimes it means changing how you engage. Sometimes it means stepping back. Sometimes it means choosing distance over debate, esteem. And sometimes it does mean walking away. The common thread is that you're no longer abandoning yourself to preserve connection. When awareness replaces amnesia, you don't become harder, esteem, you become freer. And freedom begins the moment you choose clarity over comfort.